Eastern Avenue is loud with traffic, cranes, and new construction. But beside it, in Toronto's West Don Lands, the old Dominion Wheel and Foundries buildings sit almost silent, red brick shells beside glass, asphalt, and cranes. These walls were not built for silence. They were built for weight, heat, and repetition. Iron, castings, railway wheels, and the parts that kept trains moving through a country measured by track. Pull back from this brick wall, and the map gets huge. Canada's rail system crossed provinces, ports, forests, mines, farms, and cities. Locomotives got the glory, but every mile depended on factories making parts that wore down, cracked, and had to be replaced. So the contradiction is sitting right there on Eastern Avenue. A place built to keep trains moving became silent real estate. A railway-age factory ended up in a demolition fight in 2021, protected by heritage law one moment and threatened by redevelopment pressure the next. The answer is not one villain or one sudden collapse. It starts with a foundry, a map, and a transportation system that once made this corner of Toronto matter far beyond Toronto. The map now narrows to one marked piece of ground east of downtown Toronto, the Dominion Wheel and Foundries complex on Eastern Avenue, not the whole Canadian Railway, not every factory that served it, one site where the larger system left a physical trace. On a map, it looks almost too small for the weight placed on it. A few brick buildings, a former industrial parcel, streets pressed between redevelopment sites, transit corridors, and new housing. In the railway age, usefulness was measured less by skyline height than by access to track, labor, raw material, and customers who needed heavy parts moved in and out. The first layer is geography, why this place made sense in 1917, then the machinery behind rail power, wheels, castings, repair cycles, replacement parts, then the post-war shift, as highways, trucking, diesel technology, suburbs, and new investment patterns pulled the old industrial map out of alignment. And finally, the strange afterlife of the remaining buildings. Heritage, real estate, evidence. There is no single switch you can point to and say, that is when a foundry becomes a ruin. The sharper question is slower. What changes around a factory until the factory no longer fits? Pull up an older city plan, and the ruin changes shape. It stops looking like an isolated leftover. It starts looking logical. By 1917, when Dominion Wheel and Foundries began building here, the West Don Lands and the Lower Don were already a working landscape. Rail corridors, sidings, warehouses, coal yards, factories, river flats, and brick industrial blocks packed into the east side of Toronto's core. A heavy foundry lived or died by things that were awkward, dirty, and expensive to move. Iron and steel had to come in. Fuel had to arrive in bulk. Finished wheels, castings, and machinery parts had to leave without being dragged through ordinary streets. The closer a plant sat to rail, the less friction there was between raw material, furnace, shop floor, and customer. Tracks stitched the factory into a wider industrial network. Workers could reach the district from nearby neighborhoods. Suppliers and railway customers could connect through the same corridors that made Toronto a transportation city. Inside buildings like these, the rail age had a physical rhythm. Material unloaded, metal heated, molds prepared, castings cooled, parts finished, freight cars moved again. It was hot, loud, dangerous work, organized around one fact: heavy industry follows heavy transport. Dominion belonged to a geography built for weight. The Don Lands gave it access, labor, and movement. Three things a railway foundry could not survive without. Once that geography comes into view, the romance starts to fall away. The railway becomes infrastructure. The power was not only in the locomotive, the station clock, or the passenger platform disappearing into steam. It was in everything that had to be made, worn down, inspected, replaced, and made again. A train was a moving collection of stress points. Wheels carried crushing loads over thousands of miles of steel. Axles, bearings, brake parts, couplers, rails, switches, castings, and shop tools all lived under punishment. Every curve, winter freeze, and loaded freight car turned the railway into a machine that consumed metal. That is where factories like Dominion mattered, one specialized node in a larger industrial web. Railways needed main shops for repairs, yards for sorting cars, foundries for cast components, machine shops for finishing parts, and workers who kept the system from seizing up. On a wall map, a transcontinental railway looks clean. Bold lines from ports to prairie towns, mining districts, grain elevators, and cities. On the ground, those lines depended on less celebrated places, brick buildings near sidings, ledger books tracking orders, workers moving through heat and grit, metal cooling in molds before it became part of something that could roll. Dominion's importance sits between national myth and industrial reality. The railway age needed symbols, but it survived on maintenance. Each wheel silhouette is a reminder that rail power was never a finished achievement. It was a daily act of repair. After the Second World War, Canada and the rest of North America kept moving faster. But the speed was being built somewhere else. New highways cut across the old rail logic. Cars turned distance into a personal choice. Trucks carried freight from loading dock to loading dock without waiting for a siding, timetable, or transfer yard. Suburbs spread outward along asphalt, not steel. Airports became another national network, especially for passengers who once crossed long distances by train. Again, this was not one switch being thrown, it was millions of decisions, reinforced by public investment and private demand, a family buying a car, a warehouse built beside an interchange, a province funding road expansion, a company choosing a truck route because it fit a new distribution pattern. Rail did not disappear. Freight rail remained essential, and in some corridors became more specialized, efficient, and focused on bulk movement, which rail still does extremely well. But the world around rail was no longer organized the same way. Rail technology changed too. Steam locomotives demanded coal, water, roundhouses, repair crews, and constant dirty maintenance. Diesel locomotives brought different components, shops, suppliers, and more standardization across fleets. For Dominion, the danger was not that trains vanished. The danger was that the old urban industrial web that supported rail's golden age lost its central position. Capital followed new arteries. Downtown industrial land became less indispensable and more valuable. Heavy manufacturing faced modernization, consolidation, changing orders, and rising urban land costs. This is where the clean headline breaks. Highways mattered, cars and trucks mattered, dieselization mattered. But Dominion was not struck down by one road, one engine, or one boardroom decision. It was slowly pushed out of alignment with the city and the industry around it. The buildings on Eastern Avenue had been designed for a world where heavy materials moved by rail, urban industrial land could be noisy and central, and a specialized foundry could sit close to tracks, workers, and customers. In that world, the location was an advantage. As Toronto changed, that same location started to look less like an industrial advantage and more like a problem to be solved. Land near the core was no longer just a place to pour metal and store castings. It was future housing, offices, parks, and tax base. The value of the ground began to separate from the value of the work done on it. At the same time, the rail economy around the foundry grew leaner and more standardized. Steam-era support systems thinned, orders changed, suppliers consolidated. Old factories faced the cost of modern equipment, environmental expectations, and competition, while the city learned to see brick industrial blocks as leftovers from another age. That is why the ruin matters. It is evidence of a system that changed shape until one of its former parts no longer fit. Once the industrial purpose faded, the buildings were judged by what their walls were worth to the city around them. That change in judgment entered the official record long before demolition machines arrived. In 2004, The Dominion Wheel and Foundries buildings at Eastern Avenue were designated under the Ontario Heritage Act, recognized as part of Toronto's industrial record, early 20th century factory architecture tied to the city's rail and manufacturing past. A heritage designation does not freeze a city in place. It does not answer every question about housing, public land, cost, or reuse. But it puts a marker down. Before these walls are treated as ordinary obstacles, their history has to be weighed in public. Then, in January 2021, the argument became visible. As redevelopment plans advanced in the West Don lands, demolition work began on the Foundry site in the context of a provincial minister's zoning order. To many Torontonians, the shock was not simply that old buildings might change, it was that designated industrial heritage appeared to be coming down with little municipal process and almost no time for public response. Community advocates, heritage groups, and local voices organized, and a legal challenge followed. Late that month, the Ontario Superior Court granted an injunction halting demolition, giving the buildings a temporary reprieve and forcing the conflict into courts, reports, and negotiated plans. What emerged was not a return to the working foundry. It was a compromise. Redevelopment would continue, but key heritage facades and elements would be preserved and incorporated rather than erased outright. For some, that was a rescue. For others, only a historic skin around a new urban future. The city needs homes, infrastructure, and usable land. It also needs physical evidence of the people and systems that made the city possible before glass towers filled the skyline. Once a foundry stops making wheels, its last product may be an argument over progress, memory, and how much of the industrial past can remain. After that fight, the foundry reads differently. Not just an old industrial shell waiting for reuse, but a surviving page from a larger map. The brick walls on Eastern Avenue are not the railway empire itself. They cannot bring back the furnace heat, the weight of cast wheels on the floor, or the network of suppliers, repair shops, yards, and workers that once made this part of Toronto useful to the country's transportation system. A preserved facade can hold a line in the street. It cannot preserve the economy that gave that line its purpose. But that does not make the fragment meaningless. It changes what the fragment can still do. These walls are evidence of a time when rail shaped where industry gathered, where labor was needed, and how national power moved through ordinary places, through stations and locomotives, but also through foundries beside corridors, where heavy material could arrive and finished parts could leave. Rail did not disappear from Canada. Freight trains still move through the landscape, and steel tracks still carry a large share of the country's bulk goods. What disappeared was the older urban world built around rail as the dominant organizing force, the dense belt of factories, sidings, coal yards, machine shops, and working districts that made a place like Dominion feel inevitable. That is why this particular ruin matters. Without physical traces like this, an industrial order can vanish from memory while the city keeps building over the ground where it stood. So the story ends here, not with one culprit, with a system finally visible. Dominion Wheel and Foundries was never the whole railway empire. It was one brick and steel piece of it, a place where material, labor, customers, maps, and transport policy met in physical form. When that world worked, factories like this made sense. Heavy parts could arrive by rail, skilled workers could shape them, and finished components could move back into the network that needed them. When the country reorganized around different machines, roads, land values, and ideas of progress, the building did not have to vanish overnight for its purpose to disappear. A factory can close, a supply chain can move, a city can build upward around what is left. But once the traces are gone, it becomes harder to see the world that made them necessary. So the Dominion Foundry remains as a fragment, not the empire itself, but proof that it was here, in the brick, in the rails, in the workers, and in the choices that taught a country how to move. If you want more stories from the forgotten industrial world, stay with Rusted Empire.